Well, Sully's on the couch and he's ready to go, and y'all are ready to go, and Scout's just now jumping off the table, so I guess she's ready to go too. Never mind, she changed her mind. So I'm Miss Collier, and don't do that. On this episode of the Tortilla Cat Files, we're gonna look at Benedict Arnold. He is one of the most well-known traitors in America. Traitors, not traders. I have an accent, sorry about that. So let me share my screen here with my mad technical skills. And let's look at Benedict Arnold. There we go. Okay. Benedict Arnold was born on January the 14th in 1741 in Norwich, Connecticut. So he was born in America. He was not born in England and moved over. His mother was from a wealthy family, but his father was sort of a failed businessman and an alcoholic. And so he took all of the money that they got from his mother, being a wealthy person, and spent it all. And so the family was very poor and had lots of debt. So therefore, Benedict was forced to leave school when he was 14 years old, and he was apprenticed to an apothecary. And an apothecary, he was apprenticed for 8 years. That was the standard contract, I think. And an apothecary was sort of like a pharmacist. Back then, he would make medicines and sell them and sell herbs and things like that. I mean, it wasn't the little pill bottles that you get now because those didn't exist. But he was kind of a slightly medical person. It was a very good living if you were a good apothecary. You could make a good living at it. When the French and Indian War broke out, Benedict Arnold served as a soldier in the French and Indian War. After the war was over, he became a successful businessman. He was a trader. He had opened trader this time. He opened a general store, which was sort of like a little grocery store that sold cloth and other stuff too, sort of like the Walmart Supercenter of its day. It was not as big. It didn't have as many things because there weren't as many things invented yet, but it sold a little bit of everything. He had some ships, and it's fairly clear that when the Stamp and the Sugar Acts were passed, he used his boats to smuggle things into the colonies and sell them without the stamps on them. But he, at some point, also joined the Sons of Liberty. And in 1767, he married a lady named Margaret Mansfield, and they had 3 children. Now, she died in 1775. Sorry, I got a little bit of a cough this morning. It's not COVID, it's just allergies, I promise. The American Revolution began, or was getting close to beginning. He joined the Continental Army in April of 1775. He'd had training as a soldier, remember. He was partnered with Ethan Allen, who was a famous general, and the Green Mountain Boys from Vermont, which was a group, a regiment of guys from Vermont. And they were going to attack and capture Fort Ticonderoga in New York. And they did that on May the 10th, 1775. The attack was successful. Fort Ticonderoga surrendered, and they took that over. It was British controlled, and they took that over, and it became an American fort. So he did well on his first big outing. But then there was the attack on Quebec City. Now, Quebec is part of Canada. And the Americans it was held at that point by the British. And the Americans kind of thought, you know what? Canada's kind of like just us to the north. We'll just go up there and they'll join us too. And then we'll all kick the British out of the North American continent, and we won't have to worry about them at all. So Arnold led an expedition that left from Maine and marched up to Quebec in the winter of 1775. Now, the problem was that his men were enlisted, and all of their enlistments ran out on January the 1st, 1776. So if they decided they didn't want to be there anymore, there was nothing he could do about that. They could just leave and go home. So he decided he'd better attack before that happened. So they attacked Quebec City during a blizzard on December the 31st, 1775. It was a disaster. They were beaten severely and sent packing back to Maine. Arnold was seriously wounded in his leg, and Canada never did join the American cause and become part of America in the Revolutionary War. So it was a disaster. So now he's 1-for-1. He, half of the time he does really well and half the time not so good. So while he was recuperating, the war continued on, and he recovered and returned to the army in the summer of 1776. So it took him a while. This was a very serious wound. There weren't doctors like there are now that actually knew as much stuff as they know now. These were doctors that were kind of making it up as they were going along. So it's kind of if it was that serious a wound, it's kind of surprising that he recovered at all, but he did. And they discovered that, hi Scout, they discovered that the British were planning to invade New York, sorry about that, New York from Canada. And Arnold believed that they would sail down to Lake Champlain and attack from there. Sail their big ships down from to Lake Champlain and attack from there. So he gathered a flotilla, which is a group of boats. That was a cool word, so I thought I'd throw that one in. 15 American boats, and they attacked the British Navy. This is arguably the first American Navy. They did not win, but they were able to delay General Carleton and the British fleet until it was too late for them to attack New York. Let me explain what that means. People didn't like to fight during the winter back then. So they had what they called attack season, which was mostly late spring. Thanks, Scout. Late spring and then the summer. And then they would kind of, when the summer was getting over and the weather was starting to turn, they would go back and stay in their camps. Remember how George Washington stayed in the camp at Valley Forge over the winter? That's what they did. It was just sort of an agreed upon thing. That's one of the reasons it was very unexpected for Arnold to attack Quebec City on December the 31st. It just wasn't done. There was no law against it. It was just what was accepted. So General Carleton didn't want to have to attack and fight during the winter. So he packed up and went back to Canada and didn't actually attack New York. Now, Arnold, one of the things about him was his personality was supposed to be a very charming, handsome man. I don't see it in his pictures myself, but standards are different now. And he was supposed to be, everybody was supposed to like him. But on the other hand, he was kind of a whiner. And he felt like he wasn't doing well in the army, that other people were getting promoted and not him. 5 guys that were junior to him, that were of lesser rank, got promoted to be over him, and he was not having it. He was put out. He felt he was being disrespected, and so he resigned from the army. Kind of that, if you won't play by my rules, I'm going to take my ball and go home kind of a thing. George Washington went and talked to him and urged him to reconsider, and he did, and Arnold returned to rejoin the army. But this is going to be kind of a constant theme of nobody likes me and nobody thinks they don't see how good I am at stuff. Now, his record was kind of spotty. He had 2 successes, but he had 1 really disastrous failure. So you can kind of see how maybe they were, I don't know about this guy just yet. Maybe he needs a little bit, we need to see a little bit more out of him before we decide which way he's going to land. Maybe that was it. I don't know. George Washington didn't write anything about why he didn't promote Benedict Arnold. So we don't know exactly. But just gotta wonder. Okay, so he returned to the army. He was assigned to support General Horatio Gates. You know, there's always a lot of generals underneath other generals. These two guys did not get along well, to the point where Gates actually relieved him of duty at one point. Said, you know, dude, don't need you. Go home, send somewhere else. Don't go, you're not in charge of anything right now. Then came the Battle of Bemis Heights on October the 7th, 1777. Arnold took a group of men against orders and attacked the British position. It was a very successful attack. It was so successful, in fact, that General, if you heard that, that was Bass. Sorry about that. He's very noisy when he runs around. So successful that the British General Burgoyne surrendered his army at the Battle of Saratoga 10 days later. The whole army just surrendered. Arnold was wounded in the same leg again. Remember, he'd had a very serious wound, and this is apparently another very serious wound. In the official reports, Gates downplayed Arnold's role and took all of the credit for himself. How do you think Arnold's going to feel about that? We already know he's got problems with Gates. We already know he's got problems with how other people are treating him. So let's see what happens now. While he was still wounded and recovering, Arnold was made the military governor of Philadelphia. That happened in 1778. He married a young lady named Peggy Shippen on April the 18th of 1789. Now, Peggy Shippen, this is her, was from a very wealthy family, and she was sort of a social butterfly. She was like, she would have been like, if that had existed, then she would have been a media influencer. She would have been a Kardashian, okay? And she was from a family who were loyalists. I mean, they supported the king. They didn't support the war. And Benedict Arnold is now married to her. He was still angry at not getting a promotion. His wife liked to live a very lavish lifestyle, spending lots of money, having big parties that everybody came to. She liked to have really pretty clothes and really nice jewels. And Benedict Arnold has a soldier's salary. There's some evidence that maybe she kind of leaned on him a little bit about, dude, you know, if you changed sides and supported the British, you could make more money. And wouldn't that be great for both of us? So he begins at this point to think about changing sides and joining the British war effort instead of staying with the American war effort. Now, if he had just resigned his commission and moved over to the British, he would be considered, you know, not a great guy, but he wouldn't be known as a traitor like he is. The reason he's known as a traitor, we're going to talk about that, is he began negotiations with the British. Look, dudes, I got some information. I'll give you some information. You give me a job in the army and you pay me a whole bunch of money. He would agree to arrange the surrender of the Fort West Point in Upper New York in return for a commission in the British Army and 20,000 pounds. And I wrote it down. 20,000 pounds back then would have been 3,569,080 pounds today. And remember, pounds are what the British dollars are called. Or today it would be $4,864,888. So he wasn't playing around. This was big money, okay? And he was going to provide the British Army papers and maps showing them how to get into West Point without being seen and take over after they were inside, so that they would now control West Point. His contact in all of these negotiations was a major named John Andre in the British Army. This is John Andre, his picture here. John Andre, was captured in 1780 in September. And the problem was he was behind in the enemy lines. He was behind the American lines because he had been to visit Benedict Arnold and get some information from him. And he was not wearing his uniform. He didn't have anything on that indicated he was a person that was in the military at all. So he was considered at that point to be a spy. If he'd had any piece of his uniform on, even if it was under his other clothes, they could have said, yeah, well, he's not really a spy. He's just covering up a little bit, but he's still wearing part of his uniform. And so they had no choice at that point but to consider him a spy. And he was hanged in October of 1780. And this upset everybody, including George Washington and all of the other Americans, because they all knew this guy, and he was apparently really a likable guy, and nobody wanted to hang him. But under the rules of the war, they decided this was their only choice, since he was not wearing his uniform. Arnold heard about the fact that John Andre had been arrested, and he fled and went straight over to the British. George Washington was really concerned about how much information Benedict Arnold had and could give the British. So he set up a plot to kidnap Benedict Arnold and bring him back to the American army, where he could be tried and at least imprisoned, but he wouldn't be given information to the British. He sent a man named Sergeant Major John Champ to pretend that he was defecting to the British and get in there and befriend Benedict Arnold and be ready to be able to kidnap him and drag him back to the American army. This went really, really well up until the night that the kidnapping was supposed to happen. Arnold was given orders by the British to report to a different place to begin a campaign against the Southern colonies. So he wasn't in place the night that they were supposed to kidnap him, and everything was set. And now the plot is blown. And so Champ just returned to the American army. This is supposed to be a painting of what he looked like when he was returning to the American army. And that was the end of the plot to kidnap Benedict Arnold. Now, the outcome, we know that the Americans won the war and the British lost. Arnold was given a commission in the British Army. Word of his betrayal became a rallying call to the American troops. And the war effort had been sort of not going well at that point. And now they have word that Benedict Arnold has betrayed them. And he was a very well-known general and liked by a lot of people, apparently. And so now this was like that dirty, dirty rat Benedict Arnold. We have to fight so that he doesn't beat us, kind of a deal. The Continental Congress actually passed a resolution to remove his name from Army records. His name may not be in Army records, but there's enough stuff written about him that we know what happened. After the war was over, he moved to England and lived in London. He only received 6,000 pounds of the 20,000 he was promised, and he was never promoted in the British Army because they didn't like him either, because he had been a traitor to the American side, and the British, I guess, were worried that, you know what, if you were a traitor to them, you might be a traitor to us, so we're not going to give you any more than we have to. He resigned the army and returned to being a trader. He got some more ships and opened another store, kind of a thing. He died in London on June the 14th of 1801. He was 60 years old. I forgot to mention that he and Margaret Shippen had, I think it was 5 children during the time period that they lived, that they were married together. When he was buried without military honors. He was buried as a Mr., not as a general. And in America, his name became synonymous with traitor. He's still, especially in older movies, if you're watching old movies, they talk about somebody being a Benedict Arnold because, he's a traitor. One weird fact about him is that there is a statue of Benedict Arnold, but only his leg at the Saratoga battlefield where he helped defeat that one British army. The plaque says it's dedicated to a brilliant soldier, but it doesn't mention his name. And you see, this is the statue here. It's just his leg, the one that got wounded, which is kind of weird when you think about it. Okay, let me stop my share. That's what I've got for you on Benedict. Oh, one other thing. This is, just a bonus. I don't know if you can hear that bird out there, but he got up really early. Anyway, when I was a kid, I used to hear people talk about Eggs Benedict. And I thought that had something to do with Benedict Arnold because it was the same name and I didn't know a whole lot. It doesn't. Eggs Benedict was invented or created by a chef named Benedict. They are not the same thing. Not the same thing. Don't make the same mistake I did. It gets embarrassing. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. If you like this show, be sure and give me a thumbs up or subscribe to the channel. I guess that's all we're going to do for today. So I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me. Okay, Sully, we're done.